Hello! I'm Dana, a Midwestern neurodivergent author, and under the name D.L. Pitchford, I publish unapologetically honest stories with real characters. Today, I want to share some of my favorite writing and editing books. I'm going to talk about some books that are well known among the authortube community, but I also want to talk about some that are not as popular. Just a couple things of note. This past week, I did my first live stream with Tanya. I'll link to her in the description. It was very small because it was a late night thing here in the US. It was morning for her where she lives. But I think it being small made it such a fun introduction. It made it a lot less scary for me because that was intimidating. But I am planning to do more live streams in the future. I have at least one more scheduled for later in the month. So without further ado, let's talk about my 5-ish favorite writing and editing books. First and foremost is The Emotion Thesaurus. This entire book series is great. The Emotion Thesaurus is probably the most recommended book for writers, and it is that for a reason. This is one of the best resources for really diving into how characters behave when they're feeling certain ways. I just have some basic ones that I tend to reference often: anger, anxiety, desire, doubt, fear, grief, insecurity, paranoia, unease. Those are ones that I reference relatively regularly, so I have them marked, but every single page in here is important and helpful. Each thing's set up, they give a definition, and then there are physical signals and behaviors. Then you have internal sensations, so what it feels like inside. Then you have mental responses, acute or long-term responses for this emotion. And then there's signs that this emotion is being suppressed, and then it has associated power verbs. So just a bunch of verbs that you can use to help show that this is what people are feeling. Every page has a little tip that's not actually related to this specific thing, but just a tip in general. I also do really recommend that you actually read the beginning parts, because it's, stuff like character research, what to know to write authentic emotion, and using dialogue to write emotion. And I will add to that the Emotional Wound Thesaurus. This one is more about diving deep into your character's trauma and showing how that trauma has affected them and what they do in the story. The Emotional Wound is like what drives them. This was, I believe, the 6th book in their series. Just like the Emotion Thesaurus, they start out with a bunch of helpful guides and information explaining what the emotional wound is and talking about how that can be used in a character arc, how you can use that for your antagonist. They also have a section at the beginning that's self-care for writers, because a lot of these things are very dark. Then when you get into the actual wounds, it's divided into sections. So there's crime and victimization, disabilities and disfigurement, failures and mistakes, injustice and hardship, misplaced trust and betrayals, specific childhood wounds, and traumatic events. I have a bunch of things marked because I find them very helpful. So this one is being held captive. I'm not going to read off all the ones I have marked because what's in here gets really dark. To just go over what it is. So examples, and then basic needs that are compromised by this wound, false beliefs that could be embraced because of this. The character may fear any of these things, possible responses and results, personality traits that may form, and then triggers that may aggravate this wound, and then opportunities to face or overcome this wound. These are things you could implement into your story, helping your character grow and overcome this trauma that they experienced. So it does that for all of these. Most of the ones I have marked are not fun, which is kind of the point. Here, this one being raised by a narcissist, which is not that far off from Billy. So some of them are darker than others. Some of them are just, my parents got divorced. Also Billy. Frankly, I wish I had this when I was writing the first book, because something like that would have been very helpful. My book came out in March March 2017. This came out October 2017. This did not exist yet when I was writing it initially, and it would have been very helpful to have. I use both of these with every book I write. They are fantastic. The authors, Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi, they have a whole bunch of books in this series. These are the best ones, but the others are all really good too. I also have the positive and negative trait thesauruses in paperback, and then I have like the rural and urban setting thesauruses in ebook form. I want to get paperback versions of those, and I need to get some of the newer ones too. These books are fantastic. These two especially, though. These are the most helpful. And not only do they have a bunch of really awesome books, they have an amazing website called Writers Helping Writers that has so many free resources on it. And you can also buy their books directly from that website, which I recommend because you should be buying your books directly from authors when you can. These are fantastic. Highly recommend. In addition to being an author, I am also a freelance editor. I started my editing business early 2019. I primarily work with copy editing and proofreading, though I do also do like manuscript critique stuff as well. And if you are an editor, this is your best friend. The Chicago Manual of Style is the official style guide for fiction. If you want to know basically everything about grammar and style and how it is used in fiction, this is the book for you. Even as an author, if you want to learn more about why your editor suggested certain changes, the info is in here. That's not to say that there aren't other really good style guides or that editors won't use those, because they will. But the Chicago Manual of Style is the standard. There are some things where it's like, that's a little weird and I don't necessarily agree with it, but that is the accepted thing. So most changes that an editor makes to your manuscript will be based on this. I will say, this is for people who have a good understanding of the basics. There is a bunch of information that you do not need to know in here. This is divided into sections. Part 1 is about the publishing process. Part 2 is style and usage, and then part 3 is source citations and indexes. The way that it talks about the publishing process is geared more toward editors than it is authors, so I'm not sure how much helpful information an author would glean from that. But even as far as like the style and usage part, there are parts that are more helpful than others. Just in general, like the sections that are most helpful to me are quotations and dialogue, names, terms, and titles of work, and numbers. Those are probably the ones that stand out the most to me, but that's because I don't often need to reference the other sections that other people may need to. So if you're not great with grammar and style, this is probably too advanced for you. The 18th edition is out now. I still need to get a new copy. I'm not sure how much has really changed, but the 17th edition is still perfectly acceptable. I said 5-ish because yet again I'm recommending 2 books for 1 point. This is Outlining Your Novel and Structuring Your Novel by K.M. Weiland. I do not see these books recommended enough because everyone is obsessing over Save the Cat, which is also good. I have read Save the Cat. I have a copy of the beat sheet saved in my Scrivener files so I can reference it. But these are also really good and they don't get talked about enough. Like Save the Cat, these focus on the 3-act story structure. Structuring Your Novel talks about all the different sections and then other things to consider. This is interesting because then what it talks about after that is scene structure. When you say a scene in a book, what I think about is a single moment in time at one place. Sometimes the place is moving. Like I have scenes where it's like, okay, we're literally walking from the dorm room to a classroom, and that counts as one scene because they're moving, like we're there with the characters the whole time. But how she defines a scene here is different. She talks about how there are 2 different types. There's what's called the scene, which is the action, and the sequel, which is the reaction. The scene is where we find conflict versus tension. This is the action part of the action-reaction dynamic duo. Big stuff happens in scenes, plot points change the course of the story, and characters act in ways that affect everything that happens afterward. These are the moments that loom large in your story. The sequel is a much quieter but but just as important factor in your story. Within the sequel, we find the characters reacting. There's not too much outright conflict, but there's plenty of tension. Sequels are where characters and readers alike are allowed to catch their breath after the wild and gripping events in the previous scenes. Reactions will be processed and decisions will be made so characters can jump right back into the next scene. Yeah, the whole last third of the book is about that kind of structure. So it's not just about your overall story structure, but how you're structuring your individual scenes. And that is some really helpful information that people don't think about enough. I actually think I like structuring a novel more than the outlining. It just goes over misconceptions about outlining, and it talks about different types of outlining. So it talks about mind maps, pictorial outline, different things you can do. So it talks about different kinds of ways you can look at it. You can do like general sketches, doing your scene list where you're connecting the dots. You can look at it from the perspective of conflict or your theme. You can look at it from the perspective of your characters and like exploring their backstory. One thing that she talks about is doing like character interviews, which is just a really fun concept. She also mentions Enneagram. If you find that sort of thing interesting, I really like using Myers-Briggs. Like, I will take the test as one of my characters to find out what their Myers-Briggs profile is. And then there's also a section about brainstorming and figuring out your setting, your world building. And then she talks about the extended outline, in which case you're talking about story structure some there. And then also an abbreviated outline, which is more like a general roadmap. This has a lot of really good information in it. I've highlighted so much stuff. She also has workbook versions of these that you can get. I just think that's really awesome and helpful. I have digital versions of those, but mostly I just reference the actual book. She also has other books. I have a copy of her book, Crafting Character Arcs. That one also has a workbook. I can't include it here because I haven't read it yet. I need to. And then she has a couple other more recent ones that I haven't even gotten copies of yet. Very helpful information. She also has a very helpful website called Helping Writers Become Authors. There's so much good information on there. She also has a podcast that's here on YouTube. I have not listened to it, so I don't know how helpful that is, but her books are very helpful. The next book is ebook only, so I will put an image of it right here. This is I Give You My Body by Diana Gabaldon. I have no idea if I'm saying her last name correctly, but we're hoping. She is the author of the Outlander series, if you didn't know, is very big. I have not read that. This book is the only Diana Gabaldon book I've ever read or intend to read. I'm not particularly interested in Outlander. This book specifically uses snippets from her own books as reference, and then like dives into how and why each of these scenes works. I'll just do a quick go over of what's in here and like what she talks about. First off, she has like a 5-minute guide to writing spicy, and then a 1-hour expanded guide with, in quotes, vivid details, striking examples, and entertaining footnotes. It's just fun in general. So she talks about like what kind of terminology to use, how you really need to focus on the emotion and being up close and personal into the events. And then she goes into like more details. Other things she talks about is like when, why, and how to shut the door. So like, how do you know if this is an important spicy scene to include, or should we just skip over it? She also talks about like spicy scenes that aren't actually spicy scenes, where like there's no actual direct interaction, there's no actual spice, but there is a spicy feeling that happens. There's a lot of imagery and metaphor that goes into these scenes, whether it is, conveying the vibes or whether it's actually happening on page. Generally though, this is a book I reference every single time I line edit a spicy scene. It is the best resource for this particular thing, as far as I'm aware. And the final book we're going to talk about is Wired for Story by Lisa Crone. I don't know how to say her last name. She's probably more well known for Story Genius. I still haven't read that one. I need to. Honestly, it's probably awesome, and I feel comfortable enough recommending that one without having actually read it yet. That is very high on my TBR, though. I will be reading that one soon. I will say, this is a book for nerds. This is not your everyday, oh, this is going to make me a better writer. It probably will, but it's about the neuroscience behind why story works. So in this, she basically talks about how our brains are literally wired to understand and pay attention to stories as an evolutionary response. We are drawn into them because stories help us survive. So I'm going to read a little bit. It's no surprise that when given a choice, people prefer fiction to nonfiction. They'd rather read a historical novel than a history book, watch a movie than a dry commentary. It's not because we're lazy sots, but because our neural circuitry is designed to crave story. The rush of intoxication a good story triggers doesn't make us closet hedonists, it makes us willing pupils, primed to absorb the myriad lessons each story imparts. Stories are a means for humans to experience something without physically experiencing it. Our brains even react the same way to hearing a story about something as they do to physically experiencing it. Stories allow us to simulate intense experiences without actually having to live through them. Story evolved as a way to explore our own mind and the minds of others as a sort of dress rehearsal for the future. It started out as a way to survive physical things like, those berries are poisonous, my friend told me the story of how they got sick, so I'm not going to eat them. But it has progressed to include a social aspect that it did not initially include. So my friend wore that shirt and got made fun of, so I'm not going to wear that shirt, to simplify it horribly. The story helps us survive not only in the life and death physical sense, but also in a life well lived social sense. This book is like a deep dive into why our brains respond the way they do to stories and how writers can use that knowledge to make better stories, to make people pay more attention to them. When I first read this, I read it as a library book, so I have actually been rereading and going through and, highlighting stuff because I hadn't done that before. That's why I only have sticky notes at the beginning because I'm not done rereading it. At the end of each chapter, there's this little guide going over everything that they talked about in the chapter. These are the main takeaways, things that you can implement as you're going through your story. Again, I have not actually read Story Genius yet, but I will read it soon, and I'm sure it will also be one that I highly recommend. This book is fantastic. Everyone should read it. There are so many writing and editing books to recommend, but those are definitely my favorite. I would love to talk more about other ones in the future, and I definitely want to go over books that I use for research as opposed to writing and editing manuals. I will definitely be doing that more as I dive into doing more fairy tale and speculative fiction. So those are my favorite writing and editing books, the ones that are most helpful and that I reference regularly while I'm writing and editing. If you have any reference book recommendations, leave them in the comments. I would love to know more about them, and I love these kinds of books. I've read so many, but there are so many that I have not gotten to yet, and I would love to hear more what your favorite reference books are. And maybe I'll do another one of these videos in the future once I have gotten more of my reference books read. See you later!